Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Thank you for being here today. I know you have a lot of choices. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. If you can, please take 10 seconds and drop a rating or a review on Apple, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds on your end can help me get better and help other Cub fans find the show. You can also now help support the CubsPS Plus podcast by going to cubspsplus.patreon.com. There are 4 support tiers that come with added perks such as access to a private Discord discussion group, access to bonus episodes, merchandise discounts in the merch store that will launch in the coming weeks, and the ability to submit priority questions ahead of time for interview guests and more. Your support will help me keep this podcast ad-free. Welcome into episode 43, the Don Schulze and Dennis Eckersley episode of this podcast. Today, let's talk about where the Cubs stand, both in terms of the game action on the field. The Cubs lost a tough one tonight. Where they stand with regard to the trade deadline. The Cubs have looked like buyers, but even if things go south, does it make sense to sell? Let's jump in. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. So I'm going to change plan a little bit tonight. This week I was all set to talk about the Carter Hawkins comments the other day and how everything and the way the Cubs are playing right now feed in the trade deadline. I'm still going to get into that. But as a weekly podcast, I don't often do game reactions. But I think the game tonight, the 3-1 loss to end this series sweep by Philadelphia, certainly warrants some discussion. So let's get into that, and then I'll get into some of the topic I had already lined up. So it's a little bit on the fly here, so bear with me. But today, so the Cubs, since we last talked, the Cubs went to London. They got that big win in the first game. Happ hit a couple home runs. They blew the Cardinals out 9-1. And Cubs are flying high at that point. They've won 11-13, and everything's looking great. They get out the next day on Sunday. Early game stateside, and it was kind of cool to have Cubs baseball in the morning. It was fun. They get out to 4 runs in the first, not so much because they hit so well, but St. Louis was sloppy, and then the Cubs did also get some big hits to take advantage of those opportunities. And then they came out, and one of the more inexplicable plays of the year, I don't have the game in front of me for the recap, but basically there were 2 outs, runner on third base, runners at first and third, I think, and ground ball, really to Nico Horner. I don't know what Trey Mancini was thinking. He made a break for the ball and then didn't really get exactly back to first base. He's kind of backpedaling to first base as Nico's throwing him the ball, and he looks up and he's trying to catch it barehanded as Stroman's coming over. It's a complete crap show, and we all know what happened. I mean, he tried to catch it barehanded. He dropped it. Then Stroman gave up a hit. They wound up scoring 3 runs in that inning. One thing I do want to address from this week, there's been a lot of, and as Cubs fans, we do this, right? We've seen the Cubs fall apart. I've been watching since 82. So I saw the meltdown in San Diego in 1984. I was around for the playoff loss in 1989, but that was probably really just losing to a better team. I've seen the Cubs look promising and fall out of playoff races. I've seen the Alex Gonzalez game and what happened against the Marlins in 2003. Caught myself. I almost slipped on that one. And, it's, as Cub fans, that's part of our lore. It's part of who we are. And there's a certain fatalism that, oh my gosh, that was a terrible play. Momentum just swung. We are now screwed. And I mean, it changed momentum in that game for sure. But regardless of Trey Mancini's mistakes, he did drive in 2 of the runs in the first inning with a huge double to dead center. And then he got hit for the next inning. And he was out of the game with the Cubs leading 4-3. I get the momentum change. But I've seen comments, everything from, well, the players just gave up at that point, or that was momentum they couldn't overcome, or because Mancini was playing first base, nobody trusts the coaches. That's garbage. These guys are young, hungry baseball players that want to play. The older guys there are a number of guys on this team with rings, Mancini included. Mancini addressed it like a pro afterwards. He took the blame. He shouldered took the loss on himself. He really shouldn't have to. It wasn't all on him. Love Stroman. He's had a great year. I'll talk more every episode until the trade deadline. The Cubs need to extend him, certainly not trade him. But he didn't pitch well that day. He didn't have sharp stuff. Turns out it's because he had a blister, and these things happen sometimes. Once the offense scored 4, they didn't get anything else the rest of the game. And so it's not 100% on Trey Mancini. Now, changing momentum, sure. It was a terrible play. It was all the things I've seen reported. It was unathletic. It was not particularly smart. It was just a horrendous play, and nobody feels that more than Trey Mancini. Let's be real. But if this team is going to unravel, completely fall apart, go in the tank over a play like that, they were never going to win in the first place. Then this was just a team built that's mentally weak, that's all those things. But I don't think that's true. This team is going to be streaky. We've seen it. Get out quick, get out hot April. Then they had a long slog and played some terrible baseball. They win 11 of 13. Like, I say it over and over again, but you're not as good as you are on your best day. You're not as bad as you are on your worst. I've seen people say, well, I knew the Cubs were not going to keep up that streak. Well, of course they weren't going to keep up that streak. They went 11 to 13. That's 900 baseball. Who plays 900 baseball? You can do that for a week or two. What I really want to see the Cubs do is I want to see them start settling into more consistency. I'd love to see them win 3 of 5, 5 out of 8. Consistently, avoid long losing streaks, maybe have a big streak in there somewhere. But if they continue to chip away, like, nobody's running away with this division. It's just not happening. I mean, the Reds are kind of streaking right now. They're young, they're hungry, they're a ton of fun. I mean, Ellie De La Cruz is tremendous. But it looks like they've lost Hunter Green for a while, and they're already thin on pitching, and he was probably their best pitcher. So, they're not going to run away and hide. Milwaukee is almost as bad offensively as the Cubs. They have excellent pitching, but I don't trust them to not sell a major piece at the deadline. I mean, they were leading the division last year, and they traded Josh Hader. So I don't believe in Pittsburgh. I mean, if we all want to say this Cubs team is awful, they beat Pittsburgh 6 in a row. So, I mean, Pittsburgh's not a great team. So they just got to keep chipping away. But let's talk about today's game. So the Cubs come back from London, whether they're jet lagged or they're just cold or whatever. I mean, Philly's hot. I mean, they're hitting the ball hard. They've had good pitching pretty much all year. So it's not embarrassing to get beat by Philadelphia. But every game this series, they came in and put runs up first. And today was no exception. So first pitch of the game, Kyle Schwarber, boom, right field off Kyle Hendricks, 1-0 Phillies. But then the Cubs come back in the bottom of the second. Cody Bellinger singles on a drive to Kyle Schwarber. And then with 2 outs, Jared Young comes up and hits another smash to right field. He continues to hit the ball hard and wound up tripling on the play, bringing Cody Bellinger, so it's 1-1. Got a brand new ball game. Then the Phillies string together some singles in the third, 3 straight singles. They had 3 straight, but it was 3 singles in the third. They wound up plating 2. They take a 3-1 lead. 3-run lead certainly didn't look good, but the Cubs fought back yesterday. They were down 7-1, wound up losing 8-5. Just get some runs, and this can be a ball game. And it looked like they were going to do just that. I mean, they came up in the bottom of the 4th, and this is the first one I have an issue with. So Dansby Swanson grounded out to lead off the inning. Cody Bellinger walked. Then Miguel Amaya singles. So now there's 1 out. We got runners at first and third. Jared Young strikes out. I'm not going to kill him for that. He's looked pretty good at the plate so far. And then Nick Madrigal comes up and, 2 outs, runner on third base. Who do we want up there? Nicky 2 strikes, right? I mean, he's making a ton of contact. He had 3 hits last night. He had 2 hits the day before. He's swinging a good bat. He doesn't swing and miss often, but he bunts. 2-out bunt, and it was also a terrible bunt. Maybe he saw something in the defense. I think the team had discussed some defensive orientations that Philly had, and some of them might allow themselves to be bunting situations, but that's not a place where you can do that. In the post game, David Ross said Madrigal did it on his own, that he lost track of the outs. He thought there was only 1 out. You got to know the situation. I mean, I've also seen people commenting that the coaches have to be telling the players that there's 2 outs. Well, right before him, Jared Young strikes out. I can guarantee you at least 6 defenders were turning around in the field, yelling 2 outs, holding up their fingers. They're getting it from the dugout. It's on the scoreboard. Like, maybe a certain coach could have said something, but Nick just has to know there's 2 outs. I deal with that with little leaguers. I mean, and most of the time they don't get it wrong. So we all make mistakes. So I'm not trying to pile on Nick. He's had a good run here, but that was just terrible baseball. It was a bad bunt, and then you're out of a scoring opportunity. So then the Cubs go out in the 5th. Kyle gets a 1-2-3 inning. So all right, let's get some runs. Let's do it again. And then Tauchman reached base when Kyle Schwarber took his eyes off the ball. I think looking for the wall, or maybe with the center fielder coming over, dropped the ball. Nico Horner singles. Now it's 1st and 3rd, nobody out. Christopher Morel is up. I mean, this is what we want. Morel's one of the guys who's been hitting the ball really well. He's really been having a good plate approach lately. I mean, one of my favorite at-bats this entire series was yesterday. He was up with the bases loaded, fell behind 0-2, and you could just see the pitcher was throwing pitches that Morel would often chase. And he didn't chase. He took a couple really close ones. I think it was pitch 4 was just below the zone. And I thought that was going to be close enough to get him rung up, but it didn't. And he went from 0-2 to a bases loaded walk, driving in a run. I mean, on the one hand, I'd love to see Morel, smack something off the fence, but that's a really good at bat for him and something that's really important for his career development. So I love that at bat. I love Morel coming up in this situation. 1st and 3rd, nobody out. I mean, the worst case scenario at this point is he hits a hard ground ball. They turn 2, but that still brings in a run and makes it a 3-2 game. So there's, very little that can go wrong, but it happened anyway. What do you do? Yep. Bunted again. Now the post game now that one was pretty inexplicable. He's one of your power hitters up. You don't want to bunt in that situation. They talked through it. They talked through the, scoring probabilities, and technically the scoring probabilities go up with runners on 2nd and 3rd and 1 out, as opposed to 1st and 3rd with nobody out. But then they fall quickly if the next hitter doesn't get a hit, because then you're down 2 outs, runner at 2nd and 3rd, you're at about a 0.6 scoring probability. But Ross again after the game said that was a batter decision, that that was not a bunt play put on by the coaches. It may have, now Morel's still a young kid, he's learning, and that's what Ross pointed to. I think Morel was just trying to help the team move a runner around, but even watching it, and the announcers called it this way too, I don't care. Anybody can blame Ross for whatever they want, that's fine. But when I was watching that real time, and then on the replay too, you could see Tauchman on 3rd base. If you're going to call bunt in that situation, you're going to do one of 2 things. You're either straight bunting for a base hit, you're running a safety squeeze, or you're running a suicide squeeze. Well, Tauchman certainly did not try to steal home, so it was not a suicide squeeze. Morel squared up more like a sacrifice bunt than a bunt for a base hit. And if you watch Tauchman come off 3rd base, he really doesn't come off like it's a safety squeeze. Like if that's a called play, that runner at 3rd base is going to come down hard. Not hard enough that they get backpicked, but they're going to come down hard so that if that bunt looks like it's at the right angle, you've got some momentum and you're going to go home. That didn't happen. So I do believe Ross when he says that was a individual player call. It was the wrong call. And honestly, between the 2 bunts, I have way more of an issue with Morel's than Madrigal's. Madrigal's was dumb and it was a bad bunt, and I will not defend the decision. But Nick in that situation, maybe trying to surprise him, bump for a base hit. Maybe not literally the worst play in the world, but taking Morel's big bat out of play for a sacrifice punt at that point, not great. And then, of course, the Cubs didn't score. Happ hit an absolute smash, but it was right at the second baseman, so there was no opportunity to do anything there. And then Dansby got called out looking. So no runs scored. And that was really probably the last time they seriously challenged. I mean, the Cubs had, another weird thing tonight was the outfield. The sky, it may be because of the smoke coming in from Canada, but there were a lot of misplays in the outfield tonight that we don't typically see. I mean, Schwarber did have a read on the ball, and maybe he just dropped it, or maybe he got distracted by the wall. But then, Brandon Marsh is an excellent center fielder typically, and you could tell he kind of wasn't sure where the ball was, and then came in, and I don't know if it got there late or something, but it bounced off his glove. I don't know exactly what happened at the end, but early in the play, it did look like he was having trouble tracking the ball. And then Happ had a couple in left field that he really didn't look. The one he completely missed. He just couldn't find it. It landed over his head for a ground rule double. And then another one, he looked a little shaky on getting to it. And then he did wind up making a nice play. So it's not like, it was terrible out there, but there were some weird things going on. But this was kind of a bad loss. I mean, not kind of a bad loss. It was a bad loss. You got a good start from Kyle. Went 7 innings, gave up 3 runs. I will take that every single time. This one's not on Kyle. Just more lack of offense, and it's frustrating with this team. So, especially with the lack of power, Patrick Wisdom was cold before he got hurt. He's been out for almost 2 weeks now. I think June 16th was the last time he played. He still leads the team with 14 home runs. I think he had 14 home runs by May 1st. Christopher Morel has come on strong, but I think he's still at 13. He might be at 14 now. I can't remember for sure. I should have that number in front of me, but I don't. But there's just not a lot of power on this team. Dansby Swanson, Seiya Suzuki, Ian Happ, none of those guys have double-digit home runs, and we're about to hit July. So when that's the case, you have to put hit after hit after hit together, string walks and hits, that kind of thing. And the Cubs have done that for stretches. They did that in April. They did that really, really well through the winning 11 of 13. But right now, this team has to get better on offense. This week was kind of starting pitching for the first 2 games, and I'm not going to worry a ton about that. I was going to talk a little bit today about Taillon, so I'll get to that in a second. But I thought the Drew Smiley start, he just didn't have his best stuff, and he got knocked around a little bit. And that's, frankly, most of the first 2 months of the season, he was pitching significantly above expectations. So he's going to, quote unquote, regress to the mean, because he's probably not going to end the year with a full season of starting pitching work and a 2.5 ERA. So he'll have some games like this, and then he'll have games, where he goes back and throws well again. I'm not worried about him long term. Jameson Taillon, I'm seeing more flashes, I guess. He got hit early, gave up a couple really hard hit balls, led to a run in the first, and then Brandon Marsh hit a couple home runs off him. But after that Marsh home run, the first Marsh home run, he set down 7 in a row. He went through a couple innings where, outside of just a couple mistake pitches, he really, I thought he looked about as good as he's looked since he's come over, which is not saying a ton because he's looked terrible most of the time. But I was looking at Taillon's page on Baseball Savant and looking at the StatCast data. One of the things I've seen is he's thrown his 4-seamer a little bit less this year. He was about a little over 35% last year, and this year he's throwing it about 31%. He's throwing the cutter a little more, throwing the sweeper more. One thing I did see, he's not throwing the sweeper at all to lefties. He's not throwing the changeup at all to righties. So he is doing a good job of avoiding those pitches that kind of break into where the hitter can see it based on their handedness. But what's really getting him killed this year, it seems like, is the cutter. And I talked about this earlier, and it's kept up. But it's not fluky either. So he's, against right-handers are hitting 357 on the cutter and slugging 571. Lefties are hitting 394 and slugging 667. And then lefties are also killing the 4-seam. 310 average and 762 slug. And one of the things, especially with the 4-seam, if you look at his pitch chart, there's a lot of middle miss. A lot. I think he's trying to get that pitch up, but he's not getting it up high enough. If you look, there's big red zone just above middle, and then it goes up from there. So he's got to locate that pitch better. When you look at luck, quote unquote luck, in terms of deviations from what you would expect to see, right-handers against the sweeper are hitting 295 and slugging 477. But if you look at the expected batting average and the expected slug, based on what he's done this year, the expected average is 190 and the expected slug is 303. So he's getting a little bit of bad luck on righties on the sweeper. And I think we've seen that. I've seen quite a few times this year where he's in a jam and a right-hander will go poke a pitch that they're reaching at, be off balance. They're out front, but they'll bloop it over second base. I would expect over time that's going to kind of regress to the mean. On the flip, though, again with right-handers, he's actually been a little bit lucky on his 4-seamer. So right-handers are hitting 176 and slugging 235 on his four-seam right now. But if you look at the expected average and expected slug, it's expected 357 and 601 for slug. So I would, if all things stay the same, I would expect that sweeper to become a better and better pitch against righties, and I would expect that the four-seamer to probably get a little bit less. But you can do that by messing with the pitch mix a little bit. The lefty stuff though is pretty on. The numbers are just bad. Lefties are killing him. He's got to really just has to locate better. When he's getting hit middle, and so it doesn't really matter what pitch you call. If you get it middle, it's going to get crushed. One thing I will say, that nothing about Taillon's numbers really, other than what I pointed out, are really all that unlucky. He did have some bad luck in that Houston game when Morel couldn't make that catch in left field that led to 4 runs. But one thing, and this is anecdotal, I don't have a way to go back and look at it, but it really seems to me like when he misses middle, hitters aren't missing that pitch. You'll see guys when they're on a run, Marcus Stroman, Kyle Hendricks, Steele will get away with it sometimes. You throw in middle, and the batter's just late on it, or they're under it, which probably means they're late. They top it, whatever, beat it into the ground. And that's just not happening. When he makes a mistake, it's getting crushed. So he'll continue to grind. One of the things Carter Hawkins said is that they see him as part of the rotation. He's going to stay there. And one thing I'm holding out some hope for is, one, Jameson Taillon has a long track record of being a productive major league starting pitcher. Unless he's pitching through an injury or something like that, he should be able to find it at some point. I also look back, and to varying degrees, John Lester, Yu Darvish, and Marcus Stroman, the 3 biggest starting pitcher free agent acquisitions the Cubs have made during this kind of championship era, all got out of the gates bad. Lester had a rough first half in 2015, came on, got better. His first half was not as rough as Taillon's, but he came in with higher expectations too. And then Marcus Stroman last year, between injuries and his own struggles, he had like a 4.69 ERA in the first half. Now he settled in. He was very good down the stretch, and then he's been excellent this year. So I'm hoping that Taillon will follow that. Yu Darvish, a lot of it was injury issues, and then with the whole Astros cheating scandal, there were thoughts about that he was tipping his pitches. So I think he was playing with mechanics, but he came in and that first year he was really rough before he went down, missing most of the year for an injury. We just have to hold out hope. They got Taillon for 4 years, $68 million, so they're not going to DFA him soon. At some point, if it continues, they may have to think about using him in the bullpen. He doesn't have options. So, where the Cubs go from here, and one of the things I want to talk about today, so in the intro, I talked about it being episode 43, the Don Schulze and Dennis Eckersley episode. And the reason I did that is I was going to talk about trades, and we'll get into what I think about where the Cubs stand as they head in the All-Star break and then start looking towards the trade deadline. When in 1984, last week I talked about the Ryne Sandberg game, June 23rd, 1984. Well, 10 days before that, the Cubs were surprisingly in first place. The record was 34-25, and they needed more pitching. So they went out and decided to go trade. That was the huge trade. Don Schulze was not the centerpiece of the trade, but he wore number 43, so I'm going to count it. They trade Don Schulze, Mel Hall, and future Hall of Famer Joe Carter to Cleveland for Rick Sutcliffe. Well, Rick Sutcliffe, George Frazier, and catcher Ron Hasse. Frazier was useful in the bullpen that year. Hasse gave Jody Davis a break from time to time. But the real get was Rick Sutcliffe. He had been a really good pitcher in LA and then in Cleveland, and the Cubs got him to settle out and take that top of the rotation spot. And boy, did he ever. They made that trade, and Sutcliffe went 16-1 the rest of the year. He won the clincher to put them in the playoffs for the first time in 39 years. And incidentally, 84 was the first time the Cubs had made the playoffs in 39 years. Right now, we're 39 years away from 1984. So in addition to feeling really old right now, there's a little bit of symmetry there. And then just a few weeks before, the Cubs had traded Bill Buckner to Boston for Dennis Eckersley and Mike Brumley. And so they brought in Eckersley as a starter, and he famously, he pitched with them. He was a good, solid starting pitcher in their rotation for a few years. In 1987, I've heard reports. I didn't go back and look them up today because I don't really want to get into make that story a key topic. But the Cubs had been interested in putting Eckersley in the bullpen, and he was resistant to it. Of course, the Cubs trade him to Oakland for a bunch of nobodies, and he does wind up obviously becoming a Hall of Fame closer. He was kind of the baddest closer in baseball for probably 5 or 6 years, maybe even longer. So I wanted to do that to kind of set the talk about trading. So the Cubs right now they are 5 games under 500. Let me bring the standings up. The Cubs are 5 games under 500. They're 5 games out of first. So we got Cincinnati, Milwaukee tied at first. Pittsburgh has moved back half game ahead of the Cubs. They're 4.5 out. And then the Cardinals remain in last place. So when you're trying to decide whether to go all in on trades or go all out on trades, well, the Cubs have said they like to trade. Jed wants to trade at the deadline. He wants to be a seller. He wants to be a buyer, or at least making some moves in the middle ground to try to get the team better for this year and or posturing for future seasons. So the Cubs have to evaluate a few things. Where are they in the division race? Where are they in the wild card race? How does the schedule look? How are we playing right now? What kind of players are we going to be losing in the offseason that may warrant being shipped out? And the Cubs are in a spot right now. So in London, Tom Ricketts came out and said, hey, we're absolutely buyers right now unless things go really in the tank. And of course, now they come home and they've lost 4 games in a row and look kind of bad doing it. I think obviously Tom wants to buy. And I know Tom has a reputation for, a lot of fans want to say he's cheap and all the, ever since biblical losses and some of the things that happened early when Theo was in charge before the Cubs won the World Series. If you look at what he's done what Tom Ricketts has done since about 2015, when the Cubs have been good, there's been money available at the deadline to trade and add pieces. In fact, one of the things probably that hastened the end of this run as much as anything is I think in some cases Theo got a little too aggressive covering some organizational flaws with trades, kind of gutted the farm system a little too much, and they weren't able to get a second championship. But I have also seen, if you look at what Tom Ricketts says and what happens, there is often virtual complete truth there. The one time I think he really stepped in and froze Jed on budget was coming out of 2020. Again, with if he's going to get out in front of reporters and talk about quote unquote biblical losses, that's not an off season where they're going to spend a lot of money. That's not going to be an off season where Jed has a lot of extras at his disposal. We cannot like Tom's decision or the fact that he talked about it at all, but that was a signal of what was going to happen for at least that season. And that led to the Yu Darvish trade because that was a chance for Jed to free up a bunch of cash that he could use to add other pieces. Tried to bring in a few guys to try to help that team, but really that was also the start of the teardown. So then 2021, he trades off Javi and Rizzo and KB, and then bullpen guys like Chafin and Tepera. And that continued through last year. But all offseason this year, there were pointers saying that the Cubs were willing to spend. Again, we can all argue about whether the Cubs spent enough. I would have liked to see them do a little more. But I think they did spend a lot of money and made this team better. But that goes back to Scott Boras at the winter meeting saying, I forget, the tom-tom drum was beating again, or whatever crazy phraseology he used on that. But Scott Boras is he's doing it for his own best interest and for his client's best interest. That's why he's the best agent in the game. But he's usually not just making stuff up out of thin air. And the Cubs did. They signed Dansby Swanson to $177 million contract. And they added a bunch of other pieces. Taillon for $68 million. Again, we can debate whether they spent well. But those decisions have been made and we have the team we have. And Tom has said all along that money will be there if Jed needs it. He said throughout the offseason that there was more money on the table for Jed to use, and it was up to Jed to decide whether or not he wanted to use it. So on the one hand, there's a little bit of business side, baseball side going at each other a little bit. But it actually makes some sense because I do think if you look at the moves he's made, I think Jed is a fairly conservative, take my time, look at the data, decide when I feel like I have to kind of decision maker. I don't know enough about Carter Hawkins yet to know where he sits, but he made some comments today we'll get into in a minute that I think really point out that he's a similar kind of thinker. So they want to build. Now let's preface this too. I've seen the Cubs are doing what they want to do. They wanted to build a team that would sell at the deadline. That's garbage. They wanted to win. Now this team was not in a position to add enough to compete with the top of the league to go for a World Series win, but this is a weak-ass division. And they're still in the hunt. They're 5 out. They've got one of the friendlier schedules in the second half of any team in baseball. And they're certainly not out of it. So they have to decide where they are. They want to win. But there's also still a recognition of if we don't win, or if it doesn't look like we're going to win, what do we do? And that's where I look at this team and, coming into the season, you're like, well, if everything goes south, but, Cody Bellinger is back to something like his early Dodgers form, that's a guy who you flip at the deadline. If the team's out of it or whatever, maybe you trade Marcus Stroman. But since the start of the season, the Cubs have made a number of moves. They've extended Ian Happ and they've extended Nico Hoerner. So now for the next 3 seasons after this one, you have Ian Happ, Seiya Suzuki, Dansby Swanson, Nico Hoerner, Justin Steele, Jameson Taillon, and then whatever young players emerge out of, the Morels, the PCAs, the Hayden Wisniewskis, all those guys. You've got those guys locked up for 3 years. So that kind of becomes your core to win and the group you want to keep. So if you decide you're not going to win this year, or you don't think you have a great shot, and that's going to take more than just these 3 losses. I mean, the Cubs are going to go play Cleveland, then they've got 4 against Milwaukee, and then they finish with the Yankees before the All-Star break. And then coming out of the All-Star break, they've got more games with the Cardinals, on and on and on. I mean, they're going to have opportunities to get back in this race. But if all of a sudden this is when they have that 10-11 game losing streak and they fall way out of it, it's a more complex question now because the Cubs, this time last year, the Cubs had been out of it for 2 months already, and they didn't really have any kind of established core. You could look and see that, okay, we've got Stroman for maybe a couple more years if he doesn't opt out. We've got Seiya Suzuki for, last year plus 4. But Wilson Contreras was probably going to go. It looked like Ian Happ was going to go, and he didn't. You had some young players that might be pieces, but you didn't really have those pieces in place to say, okay, here's our group. Here's what we're going to try to build with. Now they do. So I think the Cubs have to be serious about winning. I mean, they're a big market team with a lot of money, and regardless of what you think about their payroll, they are pretty close to the luxury tax threshold right now. They've got some room. It sounds like Tom Ricketts is also willing to go over, which makes sense because if you look at it from Tom's perspective, let's take the most cynical business corporate view, right? They've got a sports book that just opened on Tuesday that's attached to the stadium. And they're also working on launching a marquee network direct-to-consumer option in July. So you're going to take your flagship baseball network and you want fans to subscribe directly instead of going through cable. Everybody won't have to go through a cable company at that point. And you're going to sell off all the pieces. Like, that's horrible business. Like, the marketing is almost impossible at that point. And last year we saw the worst attendance at Wrigley in 25 years. Now this year it's up because the Cubs have been playing better. They've got more exciting players on the field. But if it's another sell-off, if let's say the Cubs took the worst possible scenario and sold this thing to as far back as they could, they trade Marcus Stroman, they trade Cody Bellinger, they trade Yan Gomes, they trade Julian Merriweather, they trade Michael Fulmer, just on and on and on, and take this down. So basically you have Hap, Nico, and Seiya, and Dansby, and a bunch of rookies. it's not going to sell product. And plus, that would be 3 straight sell-offs after a point where Jed said that he didn't think the teenagers they got in the Yu Darvish trade were an indication of the Cubs timeline. That's just terrible messaging. And that's the kind of stuff that would begin to put Jed's, and Carter's newish. I don't know if Carter would be seen as somebody to take over after Jed, but that would certainly be the kind of stuff that would potentially start to put Jed on the hot seat and put his job on the line. So when you look through the roster, Marcus Stroman has the opt-out. He's obviously already pushing for an extension. I think it's likely he would opt out. Frankly, it'd probably be fairly dumb not to. The Cubs have him next year on a player option for $25 million. 23.6 against the luxury, against the CBT. But if he's going to opt out, you are going to have to do better than that to keep him. Sorry, I did wrong. That's what he makes this year. Next year's player options for $21 million. He's still 23.6 against the CBT because that's an average per year value. So that $21 million is a decrease in pay from what he's made the last 2. Of course, he's going to opt out, especially with the year he's having, unless something drastically changes in the second half. So the Cubs could trade him. The Cubs, one of the guys talked about a lot is Cody Bellinger. They signed him on a 1-year prove-it deal. And honestly, after April, looks like maybe he's starting to come around a little bit right now, but he's not hit well. I mean, his WRC plus in June was in Tucker Barnhart territory. I know there's some injuries in play, but he really has not been great since about mid-May. And actually really since early May. Then he got hurt. He missed almost a month. But, so I don't even know where his trade value is right now. He played center field tonight, which was good to see. I mean, the other thing with Cody Bellinger's trade value is if he can be that really good defensive center fielder and the lefty power bat, that's a huge amount of value. If his knee is not right and he can't play center field that much and he really has to play first base only, that's going to limit his trade value too. So you have to look at these guys and decide, first of all, do I want to trade? And then if I do trade, is it worth it? Am I going to get enough back to make it worth punting on the season and all the things that come that we just walk through, by lessening this team's chances to win? And I just don't know where Cody Bellinger's trade value is right now. I'm not sure it's that high. Marcus Stroman's is high. But the other thing you have to look at too is, okay, if you decide you're out of it this year, awesome. Maybe it doesn't matter because you're going to go add more pieces next off season. But you have to be careful what you get rid of. So Marcus Stroman's a guy who said he wants to stay. Fans love him. Honestly, they built their defense for his style of pitching, and Kyle Hendricks and Justin Steele too. But he is probably a better pitcher in Chicago with Nico Horner and Dansby Swanson and a good defensive center fielder behind him than he would be a lot of other places, because he gets a lot of those weak ground balls and those guys just hoover them up all day long. So if you trade Marcus Stroman, sure, there's a chance that the Cubs could sign him back in the offseason. But once you trade him, there's no guarantee he takes the opt-out with the other team. He may wind up in some place he loves. Maybe they almost get to a championship and he says, you know what, I'm going to run this back. I'm going to go ahead and stick to my deal and try to go win a ring. Or he just hits the market. And then once we saw last offseason, once guys hit the market, I mean, everybody was projecting 7-8 years, for Xander Bogaerts, and all of a sudden the Padres come in off the top rope with the 11-year, $300 million deal. So once he's out there, you don't know what people are going to offer. He is 32, and he's a contact pitcher, so that is going to limit his upside a little bit in terms of, who's willing to maybe come off the top rope with a 5, 6, 7-year deal for, $150, $200 million. Like, I don't think he's going to see that money. But I could see him getting 26, 28 million, maybe as high as 30 million per year if it's a shorter contract, maybe like a 330 or something up to like a, I don't know, 5 years, 28 would come out to like $130 million. I think he's going to be kind of in that range somewhere. Drew Smiley's a guy they can trade. He would have some trade value, certainly as a lefty. He's pitched well as a starter and out of the bullpen. He was a key bullpen arm for the Braves on their championship run a couple years ago. But after that, there's just not a ton to sell. Like I'm looking at their roster on Spotrac with their contract info. There's Stroman, Seiya Suzuki, Dansby Swanson, Jameson Taillon are not going to be traded. Kyle Hendricks is tradable. He's got a team option next year that I don't think the Cubs are going to pick up the option, but I think there's a pretty good chance that they're going to, if he keeps pitching like this, there's a good chance that they're going to certainly negotiate to keep around Chicago. I've not heard anything to indicate he wouldn't want to stay. He's basically, I know the Cubs traded for him, but he's basically played his whole career in Chicago. Trey Mancini's not tradable. Yan Gomes is tradable, but for $6 million on a team option for next year, and a young catcher in Amaya with Hayden McGeary coming up the system fast, I'm not sure why you'd trade Gomes. I think he's more valuable as that mentor and hopefully Amaya's backup next year than he is as a whatever you get for him this year. But look through, Michael Fulmer, you probably get some stuff for him. He had a really rough start to the season, but he's been really good the last month. Really since May 27th, he's given up one earned run. So he's tradable. After that, though, it gets really thin. Mark Leiter Jr., Julian Merriweather are guys, hey, they're bullpen arms we could trade, but why would you trade them? They're both, I know Leiter's 32, Merriweather's 31, but they're pre-arb. If they're pitching well and, Leiter's got that nasty split that that's right now the sweeper is the hot pitch, but they were talking about on the broadcast tonight, the split's another pitch that people are looking at trying to add and maybe would be the next hot pitch. Julian Merriweather is just throwing smoke right now. So they could trade and get some stuff back for them. But again, you start to hurt next year because you can go into next year with Marcus Stroman, with Leiter in your bullpen, with Merriweather in your bullpen for basically nothing. Next offseason will be Julian Merriweather's first ARB season. But given that he's been, league minimum player, a couple years of service time, until this year hadn't really, he got put on, the Cubs claimed him off waivers from Toronto in the offseason. So he's not somebody who's put up a big pass. So, he'll get a nice bump, maybe up around $1 million and a half next year from $737,000. But, he's not going to make big money. Same with Leiter. So I don't know why you would trade those guys if you're looking at a contention window in the next few years. The only other guys, Nico Horner and Nick Madrigal are the only guys currently in ARB. Technically this season was Ian Happ's third ARB year, but now he's locked up, so that's done. And actually Nico Horner's not in ARB anymore either with his extension that locks everything up. So Nick Madrigal is the only person right now who's currently in ARB that would be in line for a raise next year. So I think they're kind of in a situation where there's not really a whole lot of choice. The only guy that's really going to get them big return is Stroman, and that hurts next year. So I really don't expect them to trade. I know I've seen some people really wanting them to, but I just don't think it makes sense. Unless the market for Bellinger is better than I think it is, or if he turns it on over the next few weeks and makes it bigger than it is right now, I just don't know if even trading him is worth it. Let's look back when the Cubs traded Jock Peterson for Bryce Ball. Nothing against Ball. He's had some good minor league seasons. He's in AA, and he's organizational depth. And at some point, he may spend some time in major leagues covering an injury, make it trade somewhere else. But if that's the caliber of player the Cubs are going to get back for Cody Bellinger, what's the point? Just keep Cody and hope things get hot in the second half. The mistakes that were made were largely made this offseason. There continue to be roster construction issues. And one of the things that Carter talked about this week and was going to be the kind of lead topic of this episode was what he looks at for decision making. He goes in and he wants as much information as possible to make a decision, which is totally fine. That's how life is. That's how I am if I'm buying a car, looking at a house, or trying to decide, do I want to take a new job or do I want to start a podcast? I want to get all the information I can to make the best possible decision. It makes total sense. And then Carter was talking about how there are reversible decisions and irreversible decisions. So when the Cubs saw Nick Madrigal not going so well, they can option him to Iowa because he came into the season with 3 option years left. You can send him down if you decide, he has to wait 10 days unless there's another injury. But if you wait those 10 days and decide that was a mistake, or now he's fixed something, You can reverse that move. You can call him right back up. Cubs have done that with Javier Assad multiple times, Miles Mastrobuoni multiple times, Nelson Velasquez multiple times, Edwin Rios a couple times. I mean, those are guys you can bring up, send down. It's maybe not great for their development, but it is what it is, and that's kind of the game of Major League Baseball. The non-reversible decisions or the irreversible decisions are DFAs, trades. The Cubs make a trade and send somebody. I think the Mets, if they could reverse it, would reverse that PCA trade 100 times. But once you trade a player, he's no longer yours. Once you put a guy on irrevocable waivers, he's either going to get traded or released or something. So it makes sense that's why you don't see a lot of players, if they're a fringe, deep bench player and they're off to a bad start, maybe they get cut or sent down. But, if you go sign a free agent in the offseason and the free agent gets off to a terrible start, like Trey Mancini, Eric Hosmer. Actually, Trey Mancini wasn't that bad early. He got cooler late, but Eric Hosmer, Taillon, you just don't see teams cutting guys like that in the first month of the season. You want to get some sample size in there. You want to see if you can get things right. There's no clear magic number, but it seems, kind of a 6 weeks, 100 plate appearances, 5-6 starts kind of thing is kind of the floor, because you don't want to, oh my God, this guy looks terrible, let's get rid of him. And then he promptly signs with another team for the league minimum. And then he suddenly is the guy you thought you signed because he just got off to a bad start. Or maybe he was putting too much pressure on himself in a new city or whatever the reason. So you do that. And now as you go to the deadline, the Cubs have not been, I'm sure there are calls being made all the time. I don't think that any GM in baseball right now is just sitting around doing nothing. I mean, they're looking at data, they're sending scouts out, they're doing all kinds of things. But right now there kind of is no trade market. I mean, if you look at the standings and bring them up here, let's go National League first. I mean, probably the Cardinals could still be considered in the race if they really want to be aggressive and make some changes. They're probably not, but 9.5 out in this division. Teams have come back for more. The big issue there is they're trailing 4 teams that have a significant jump on them. But, Atlanta is probably on the verge of running away with the East. But Miami, Philadelphia are very much in the wild card race. Washington's out. The Mets are looking more and more out every day at 36 and 45. But in the West, the Arizona's a surprising division leader. The Dodgers are 2.5 back. San Francisco's 2.5 back. San Diego has been a bit of a disaster this year, like the Mets, and they're 10.5 out of the division, but they're still kind of in shot for the wild card, and they're still super talented. Colorado's done. They're out. And you look at the AL East, like every team, Baltimore's kind of hanging with Tampa Bay. They're 5.5 out. I think those are probably the 2 teams. If anybody's going to catch Tampa in the East, it's going to be Baltimore. But the other, except for maybe Boston, who's now fallen under 500, the other teams are still in play for the wild card. In the Central, it's a crappy division again, like the NL Central, but Kansas City is dead. Everybody else is within 5 games of first place, so they're all fighting for something. And then in the West, you've got Texas as a bit of a surprise leader. Then Houston, the Angels are 5 and 6 games out. And Seattle's 10 out. Seattle's kind of been a big disappointment this year, but they could still get back into at least the wild card race. So right now, it's hard to even know what's available on the market. I think it's safe to say Colorado, Washington, Kansas City, Oakland are maybe St. Louis. I don't even think St. Louis is going to sell, but there are about 4 or 5 teams right now that are clear sellers. There are going to be a few more that fall out of it further as we get to the All-Star break and a couple weeks beyond. But at this point, Detroit, they're 35 and 45. So the record would say they're sellers, but they're 4 games out of first place in a division where nobody's running away and everybody is looking pretty flawed. So do they think they have the talent? I mean, they acquired a bunch of guys in free agency last year. Do they think they have enough to go add a couple pieces and take a shot? Like, I don't think any of those teams are going to be big adders. But it may mean that, like Javi Baez he's not having a great season. He's had some hot and cold streaks, but on the whole, he's not been great. Would they trade him because he has an opt-out this offseason? No. Javi Baez has not been that great, so I don't know that he'll take his opt-out because I don't know if he would be able to match that money out on the market. But, that's going to play in their decision. Do they want to trade a guy like that or just keep him and see if they get hot for a couple months? So it is early, and that's what Jed's talking about. And they're also talking about waiting to make that decision. Like, it was clearly time to cut Hosmer, and in retrospect, they could have done it earlier. I think, we've also seen some talk about Amaya, like, why didn't he break with the team? Well, I don't know that, Tucker Barnhart's not the guy I would have picked in the offseason. I talked about that before. I don't know why there wasn't more action or talk with Christian Vasquez. But if I thought I had a chance to win this season, I would not have gone into opening day with Amaya as the backup catcher for Yan Gomes. Nothing against Amaya. Like, his game is clearly solid. I mean, he was a top 50 prospect in baseball in 2018, 2019. He was the top or maybe second to Braylon Marquez in terms of the best prospect in the Cubs system. But he last played a full season in 2018. He had some injuries that shortened 2019. He didn't play in 2020. Then early in the 2021 season, he tore his UCL, so he had Tommy John surgery, which took him out until last mid to late July, I believe. But even then, like Bryce Harper's doing now in Philly, he was really just DHing. He didn't catch. He may have caught one or two games at the very end of the year, but he really didn't catch at all regularly until the Arizona Fall League. And that's not the same as a Major League Baseball season. So to come in with him, even with his raw tools, as, hey, he's our backup catcher and we're not going to have another veteran to go to with this young pitching staff, I think that would have been a short-sighted move. Now, Tucker Barnhart came in as a guy with a reputation for not hitting, and he's hit even less than he typically does, which is not great. But, David Ross came in 2015 and really hit very, very poorly, but played a good catcher. And then he hit in 2016. Now we'll see. Tucker Barnhart also doesn't make a ton of money. He's got a player option next year for $3.25. I think there's no doubt he's going to take it unless the Cubs DFA him before that and pay whatever the buyout is. But, that's not money that's going to stop them from doing anything. It's a drop of the bucket. So I think there are decisions that could have been made differently, would have been made differently, certainly if I was running the team, but that doesn't matter. So now they have to look at the roster they have and what are we going to do? I don't think selling makes sense. There may be some limited sell. I think Nick Madrigal is a guy who, as well as he's played at third base, he's been better than I thought he would be. He's still not a guy I don't think projects as a regular everyday third baseman. I mean, he's fine on the routine plays, and he's actually got pretty good hands. If it's hit near him, he will field it pretty well. But he just does not have the arm. I mean, he's playing a shallow third base, and the reason he's doing that is so we can get the ball faster and have time to, take the shuffle steps and get a good throw off to first base. He's not a guy who can be super effective playing deep third base, moving down the line, and, you move two steps to your, Nick Madrigal moves two steps to his arm side to get a ball going down the line and gets it with his momentum going into foul territory. He just doesn't have the arm to make that throw to first base. So he's a guy who I could see having trade value, and he wouldn't be a sell or buy guy. He might be a guy where you find, I don't know how they line up. I haven't looked at the trade values yet, but I've seen a lot of talk about the Cubs bringing Jamer Candelario back from Washington because they're out of it. He's a free agent after this season, having a pretty decent year. Good glove. Maybe Nick Madrigal is a kind of player that Washington can plug in, let him play every day, play second base, lead off, whatever it is. There are teams out there that have a need for that and would value that. So maybe there's a package to be made where you're not selling Nick Madrigal, you're moving Nick Madrigal to try to get a piece back that you think just fits better. Or not. Or maybe Nick Madrigal is just the starting third baseman for the rest of this year, and then the Cubs look at it next year. I still think it's interesting. Alex Cohen, when I talked to him a couple weeks ago, he said that he thinks Christopher Morel will eventually get a chance at third base. Certainly haven't seen it yet. If he could play third base and play, I don't expect him to be great defensively. We all saw the throwing issues last year. But if he can play and be a reasonable third baseman with that bat, all of a sudden that's a good place for him. And then that gives you more flexibility at the DH slot, things like that. So more to come. It was a rough week. The Cubs start a series with the Guardians at home tomorrow afternoon. Hopefully the Cubs can get right. The Guardians are not playing great baseball. They're 2 games under 500. They have won 7 of their last 10, but they just recently lost. They're 19-22 on the road. They're a very beatable team, and the Cubs, I think, are going to come in that series as favorites. They have Justin Steele going tomorrow against Paul Quantrill. That's certainly a matchup that favors the Cubs. On Saturday, the Cubs hopefully have Stroman. He pitched a bullpen session today. I've not heard how that went. Hopefully the blister's okay. I don't know if it might not be the worst thing in the world if he missed the start, but they need it right now. If they can get Steele and Stroman to go in the first 2 games of the series, that's huge. And then in the third game of the series would be Taillon against Savale. And that might be advantage Cleveland, but at that point, hopefully the Cubs have already won the series and are going for the sweep, but we know they play on Sundays. So get the next 2, and then you got a 4-gamer against Milwaukee. That's going to be a big series. If the Cubs can, it's at Milwaukee. If the Cubs can split, that's probably the floor of what you would want to do in that series. But if they could win 3 out of 4 or even sweep, well, they're right back in this race. So I don't think this Cubs team is going to quit. I don't think they're going to go into a mental tailspin. I think they're just not playing baseball great right now. And just like we saw earlier this season, you're hot until you're not, and you're cold until you're not. And sometimes there's a reason why you go cold. You have some injuries. Maybe the London trip just disrupted things to some extent, but they could just as easily have been playing a normal schedule, gone to St. Louis for that series, won the first, lost on Sunday, and then come home and lose 3 in a row to a pretty good Philly team. So I think this team will bounce back. They need to. If they do rip off a 11-game losing streak heading in the All-Star break, that is where a GM or manager might get fired. That is where plans change, and maybe they become sellers, and maybe they do something that disrupts next year with Marcus Stroman. I don't want to see that. I've said all along, the Cubs are still right in the ballpark of where all the projections had them. I know it's super frustrating when they look really good for 2 weeks and then they cool off again. But this team was projected to win 74 to 80 games by most places, and that's kind of what they're in line to do right now. With the easier schedule in the second half, or easier on paper, there's reason to think that they're going to do more. And if they can do that, that's great. They'll have opportunities to get back in this race. But I think we all just need to watch. And obviously, we can't do anything, so we're just talking here. But I'm trying to keep a level head here. Take it as it comes. Tonight was pretty frustrating, especially the bad baseball and the bunts. But they need to get that stuff cleaned up and then see where it goes. But we're going to know a lot more about this team in the next 2-3 weeks, and we'll see. I would love to see, sometimes you have a team like this that's capable of doing more, and then you just add that piece and it clicks. The Cubs are missing something, and we'll see. Seiya Suzuki missed his 2nd game in a row tonight, got some neck thing. I'm fine with them. The Cubs don't play their deep bench very often anyway, so I don't mind them giving Seiya a couple days to get this out. But given the funk he's in, if his neck is not right and he's not feeling great tomorrow, I'd probably think pretty hard about maybe putting him on the IL to get it squared away. Just let him sit through the All-Star break, get healthy, get right, let him go work on some things, and bring up like Nelson Velasquez and let him get some time in the outfield. And then to give this lineup a spark. They need some pop. So more to come there. It's 4th of July weekend, so I hope you guys all have a great time, enjoy time with friends or family, whatever it is you decide to do. Stay safe, be well, and we'll talk again next week. Thank you for joining me today. If you liked the discussion, or maybe especially if you didn't, please drop a rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts, or tell a friend about the show. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, all at CubsPS+. And check out the Patreon page, CubsPSPlus.patreon.com. to help support the show and keep it ad-free. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!